Hey folks, Kostya here, and I'm recording this from lovely Barcelona, Spain, where I just finished playing in the 2023 Sunway Chess Open. This was a very, very strong tournament, tons of grandmasters, lots and lots of high-rated players, and it was a very long event, 10 rounds, and this video I'm just going to be recapping the event, playing through a bunch of my games and talking a little bit about my performance in the tournament and so on and so forth. Overall, I just want to say this was a very enjoyable tournament experience for me. It's been a while since I played in Europe. Actually, the last time I played overseas was before the pandemic. So yeah, as you can imagine, it's been a couple of years. And I can tell you guys I really, really missed the European atmosphere, playing one round per day. I just feel like it just makes for such a really much more pleasant tournament experience when you only have one round to prep for. You have ample time to get ready for the game, to eat, to look at the game afterwards, recover, prep for the next round. Of course, in comparison to American tournaments, American Opens that are usually held over like 5-6 days, you got 2 rounds per day, which, is often just like an absolutely grueling schedule. And as far as the tournament conditions are concerned, it was a really, really nice venue, beautiful location, right on the coast of Spain, like near the beach. The weather was nice, of course, in December. It was nice to escape the winter, and the food was good. I thought the organization was absolutely tremendous, and it was also just a very fun tournament. Like there's a bunch of side events, lots of social activities. So it wasn't just about the chess. I got to meet a bunch of very, very cool, very nice chess friends as well. So that was, of course, very, very rewarding for me. Overall, my tournament, I would say, was not bad. I finished with 6 points out of 10. I think I gained a couple of FIDE points, so it wasn't like, an amazing performance or anything. But these days, generally, I'm happy as long as I actually don't lose points in tournaments, because it's very tough. You're playing a lot of like underrated juniors. People are still underrated from the pandemic. FIDE ratings are kind of a mess right now. I know they're changing them in the new year to boost a bunch of players. So generally speaking, yeah, I'm happy as long as I don't lose points, because I feel like if I can get some good games in, I can learn from the games. Of course, this isn't going to be my last tournament. And yeah, every game that's interesting and useful, will hopefully improve my chess in the long run. At least that's how I try to look at it. So starting with round 1, let's just get into the tournament. I was playing down in the first round. I was playing a French player, Benoit Gayon, older gentleman. And this was, I would say, a fairly straightforward game for me. There was a lot of interesting moments, but actually I was quite happy with my play in the later middle game, which I will share with you guys here. So my opponent is a Benko player, and he went for the Benko gambit here, slightly different move order. I went for this variation with Queen C2, which I'm kind of fond of, rather than going for the full Benko, accepting the pawn sacrifice. I'd rather just get kind of a normal type of Benoni structure and then just play that. And I was quite happy with the position I got out of the opening in this game. We're following some theory here, castles, h3. Both sides, I'd say, are making normal moves. Bishop a6. Black tries to trade off a minor piece because, of course, they have less space, and this helps them. Knight a3, I want to recapture on my own terms. Takes, and knight d7. Here is where I was out of book, so I was already thinking on my own. I realized Black's idea, of course, is to play knight to b6 here and continue trying to trade off pieces, eventually play rook to b8 and put pressure on the b file. And I wasn't exactly sure how to deal with this. Analyzing after the game, I now understand maybe the best try here was to play the move a4, with the idea that after knight to b6, White can avoid this trade with a move like either knight a3 or knight e3. I think both of these are reasonable options. And then the idea would be to kick Black's knight with a5 and then reestablish White's knight on c4. And I think I kind of considered this idea during the game, but yeah, I didn't quite want to go for it here. I wasn't totally sure. So I ended up deciding on this move, bishop to d2, which I think is quite logical. The idea is to put the bishop on c3 and either play for e4, e5, or challenge Black's dark squared bishop. And we end up getting a position that I kind of anticipated when I made this move. So knight b6, I go b3 here. The idea is to take back on c4 with the pawn, so I don't have a weakness on b2, and I can also fight for the b file. Knight d7, I thought this was very logical. This is what I was expecting. Bishop c3, black trades bishops, otherwise I'm going to take on g7, queen takes c3. And I wasn't sure exactly what the evaluation is of this position. I thought maybe white is at least slightly better. My plan is to play for the e5 break and get some pressure in the center. If black takes, then I can take back and eventually try to target the e pawn as well as the c pawn. So my opponent played f6, which I was very much expecting. It's probably not the best move in the position. I was analyzing a bit, and I think, in fact, if black just kind of plays very simply with rook to b8, followed by like rook to b4, eventually queen to either c7 or b6, I think black can allow the e5 pawn break and basically be okay here. But f6 was played, which again I think is very logical, and this was kind of what I was expecting during the game. It is a bit weakening, but it stops white from playing e5 for some time, and there's reduced material, so black's king I think doesn't have too many worries just yet. And yeah, now I decided to start with h4. I don't know if this is the best move. Again, it felt logical to me during the game. The idea is to just try to kind of provoke some weaknesses on the king side. And this ended up working out because my opponent played h5, which I definitely think was incorrect here because it does leave black's king side much weaker than before. Other options I had, for example, I think one very interesting idea would have been to play like knight e1, knight d3 here to bring the knight on d3 and then advance the f pawn. So again, white is playing for e5. But the thing I didn't realize during the game is knight on d3 actually holds the queen side very well because it covers b2 square, covers the b4 square, and so it covers a lot of the entry squares that black might use for their counterplay. But h4 does end up working out in the game. h5 is played. Now I quickly played knight h2, and the idea here is I'm making room for the f pawn, but I'm also introducing some g4 breaks in the position as well. So king h7, I go f4. Rook to g8, black starts kind of playing against the incoming king side attack. And here I realized, I should just bring back the knight to f3. And the point is now I'm playing for e5, and I really want to actually win the g5 square, where my knight can, of course, be very strong, also looking at e6. So by e5, I'm trying to trade off this f pawn. Black played rook b8. I decided to just go e5 immediately. I didn't see a reason not to. Now I'm just opening the king side up and playing against black's king. Black played queen to b6, which I thought is basically pretty logical because it's very hard for black to take on e5 and kind of survive that. But now this allows white to push e6, which I took the opportunity to do because this forces the knight back to f8. And as you can see, black's pieces now are completely disjointed here because the knight on f8 has no moves. It's blocking the rook on g8, so black's rooks are disconnected, and it's going to take black some time to actually get this knight back into the game. So I definitely felt like I should have a strategically winning position here, though it's not totally easy to figure out exactly how white should proceed. I ended up going for a4 here, which I think is a decent move. The idea is just to play a5 and harass black's queen. And here, if black goes for any kind of endgame like queen b4 or queen b2, I was actually very happy to just trade here and go for any of these endgames because I felt like because black's rook on g8 is going to be out of the game for some time, I can afford to basically sacrifice a pawn, bring my rook to b7, and I felt like this should be very, very good for white. I'm either taking the a pawn or the e pawn here, and either way, white is going to get a very strong pass pawn. It's going to be very difficult for black to deal with their pieces so passive. So, of course, my opponent didn't go for that. He goes for king h6, which I think is a better try, just immediately trying to get the knight back into the game. And I realized black's plan here is probably to play like f5, bring the knight to f6, and so on, knight to e4, where black can be okay. So I felt like I had to act quickly. I pushed a5. Black put the queen on a6 to target the c4 pawn. And now I pushed f5. I don't know if this was actually the best thing to do. One very interesting possibility I considered here already was knight to g5, where of course black cannot take because they're going to get mated after takes, king h7, rook f7 check. But the reason I didn't do this is because I wasn't quite sure about my follow-up. Like I can put the knight on f7, but then I was like, then what? But looking at it now, actually, this would have been strong because the knight goes to f7 and then white just breaks with f5. And eventually the king side opens up and this knight on f7 is going to be covering a lot of important squares that black needs. So that was definitely better. I decided to push f5 first. And here I'm just trying to open up the king side. Black plays rook to b4, going after the c-pawn. I gave queen e3 check, king h7. And yeah, originally my idea here was to just play knight to d2, where I thought white has a very nice position. Opening up the rook, I'm covering c4. If g5, for example, I have takes, and knight e4. And the idea here is that I'm hitting the rook, and I'm also threatening knight takes f6 check, followed by pushing e7, where the e-pawn is very strong, and basically it's going to promote or cost black at least a rook. So this actually did look quite good for me, but then I just saw a very, very interesting possibility here. And once I noticed it, I just couldn't help but calculate it. And eventually I end up going for this sacrifice with knight to g5 check. And actually this ends up being maybe my favorite move of the tournament, just because I thought it was quite a nice sacrifice, a very, very cool concept. The point is, if black takes the knight, which they are forced to do, then white pushes f6, and I'm breaking through with the e-pawn. And once again, this knight on f8 is kind of embarrassed because, of course, ef6, e7, and I'm either promoting right away, or I'm also threatening to kind of win back my piece and have a very strong attack. But basically, e8 queen is the main threat, and if knight d7, white will end up with an extra exchange here and just completely winning position because black's king is way too weak and their heavy pieces are much too far from the king side. So that was kind of the general idea. Of course, I had to calculate a number of variations here. It's important to point out if black ignores the knight, then I have knight f7, and now queen h6 is just a massive threat, and black is completely busted here. So takes f6, black played rook b7, which I thought was the critical defense, just covering the e-pawn. And I think white has a couple of interesting continuations here, but before going for the sack, I spotted just a very nice move, rook a b1, which I was happy to see because it's counterintuitive when you sacrifice the piece to then offer a trade of rooks and to, I'm offering to move my rook away from the f-file. But the point is that it's just so hard for black to defend this e7 square that the trade definitely suits white. Now maybe the best try would have been rook to c7 here, where if I go for rook b8, which was kind of my intention, queen takes e4, it's actually quite unclear. But hopefully I would have paused here and maybe thought about it a little bit more and realized that white has a number of good options. I think the simplest, or let's say the strongest, definitely not the simplest, but the strongest is queen e2, which is not an easy move to make, but the point is white is just defending this pawn, and all the counterplay is still in the air. So rook to b8 is a threat. I'm also threatening to just take on g5. And black's knight here is just so stuck that, white is down a piece, but it doesn't quite feel like it. It feels like white's position is actually just completely crushing here. In any case, black did trade on b1, rook takes b1. And here on queen takes c4, I had the move rook b7 in mind, which I believe is the only winning move. Not taking on e7 first, because then knight e6 would actually be kind of unclear there. But with this move, I can take on e7 with the rook. And then the two pawns on e6 and f6 are just way, way, way too strong. So instead, black played knight takes e6 here, just trying to give back the piece immediately, but survive the heavy piece endgame. Fortunately for black, though, after de6, my pawns are still very, very strong. And I think I converted the game quite smoothly. So ef6, I threw an hg5, f5. Black is up a pawn, but their king is very weak, and this e-pawn is just extremely strong. So I was not worried about the material here whatsoever. And I basically calculated until the end of the game here. So e7, queen c8, black has to blockade the pawn. Rook e1, forcing one of the pieces to e8. And now this just kind of nice move, queen to c3, where my intention is to invade with queen f6, bring the rook to e6, and go after the g6 pawn, which is, of course, a critical weakness in black's position. And I really wanted to see the move f4 here on the board. I thought this was kind of the key defense, trying to bring the queen to f5. where I had this line as my intention. Queen f6, queen f5. I was going to trade queens here, gf5, and play rook to e6. And now the point is black is basically stuck. The rook, of course, can't move because I'm promoting. And after king to g7, approaching the pawn, I'm just in time to play g6. And this is the position I really wanted to see on the board because white is down a pawn in the rook endgame, but is actually just completely winning. Like, this is a resignable position for black because the king can't approach the pawn, the rook can't move because I promote, and that's it. Black is just reduced down to pawn moves. None of the pawns are in time to do anything. My king is ready to just come in and basically collect all the material and win the game with ease. So I was kind of hoping for this endgame because I thought it'd be very, very aesthetic, but and of course it's completely winning for white. Instead, h4 was played and the game just kind of ended very straightforwardly. Queen f6, rook e6, rook g8, and just simple combination here, e8 equals queen. If black takes with the rook, then g6 falls, and I'll basically just winning all of black's pieces here. So that was round one. It wasn't like a perfect game. There are definitely some things that I missed, but I felt like in general it was a good start to the tournament. I was happy with my sacrifice knight g5. I thought it was quite a nice creative idea. Okay, so going to round two. I was paired actually against another French player, Mathias Greget, who is definitely younger. I believe he's about 18 years old. And yeah, funny story about this game. This was round two. And in this tournament, at some point, there was actually, unfortunately, some kind of virus that started going around. A lot of players, I think, ended up getting sick and ranging from a small cold to maybe a more severe cold. I don't think it was COVID, but I definitely started feeling a little bit sick on this day, like round two. Not sick enough where I have to like skip the round, but definitely like, starting to feel some symptoms. And if you went to the playing hall, you could hear, if you paid attention, you could hear like someone coughing or sniffling like basically every couple of seconds. So I think it started around round one and two, but I think almost every player, as far as I understand, ended up getting sick or mildly sick in the tournament, which doesn't really get talked about too much, but I think this is a thing that happens in lots of events. I remember hearing stories about the last Olympiad in 2022 in Chennai, reports of, a lot of players just like getting sick and having to play. And it's tough, you don't want to infect other people, but on the other hand, if you're only like lightly sick, you feel like, you don't want to just drop out of the tournament because that's also bad as well. So very important to try and stay healthy during the tournament and follow good habits, getting good sleep, good nutrition, not, trying not to get too many germs and so on and so forth. So this was round two. And again, the funny story, I decided to take a nap before the round, as I often do. The round was supposed to start at 4:30 p.m. local time, and I set my alarm for 4 p.m. So it's like 3:20, so I'm taking like a short nap, and the idea, okay, I'm going to wake up at 4 p.m., just quickly get dressed and go down for the round. And then I woke up, I checked my phone, and I see it's 5:12 p.m. I'm so good. The round was supposed to start at 4:30. I'm looking at my phone. It's 5:12. I'm like, what happened? What happened to my alarm? So apparently I just slept through it. So I just like immediately get dressed in a panic. I knew the forfeit time was 1 hour. So I was pretty sure I wasn't going to already be forfeited for this game, but I did end up showing up very, very late, unfortunately, which was not good. So the lesson here is set multiple alarms when you're going to nap, not just one. Thankfully, I did get to the round, and we were able to play the game. I was definitely a little tilted that I gave up some time on the clock. Actually ended up only being 30 minutes down because I think my opponent was a little bit late as well. So not a great start to this game, but we ended up playing a King's Indian. And I wasn't prepared for this variation. I don't think I checked my opponent's games, but I didn't see any games where he was playing the fianchetto. So I decided to mix it up. I play this move knight to b to d7. This is not my usual repertoire, but it is a line that I've been looking at and I thought would be an interesting try. But I do end up in some serious trouble in this game. Like, we get a pretty thematic opening here. Knight c5, queen c2, rook e8, rook to d1. I played this move h6, which is probably not best. And quickly I fall into some trouble here. h3, a5, knight db5. Now black is threatening e5 because the rook is lined up against my queen. Play bishop to d7, bishop e3, queen c8, hitting the pawn. And now my opponent very correctly takes on c5, which I totally underestimated, dc, and goes king h2. And this position ends up being quite difficult for black because white just wants to play f4, e5. The pawns are advancing. The bishop on g2, when it opens up, is going to be very strong. And it's really difficult to use the dark squared bishop here because f4, e5 is going to shut everything down. In fact, it would have even been stronger for white to go f4 immediately, with the idea that if I take on h3, white can play knight takes c7. And that ends up working out quite nicely for white. But anyway, king h2 was pretty logical here. And after some thought, I decided to go for a pretty daring idea with rook to e5. And the point here is, of course, I'm provoking f4, but I'm trying to swing the rook over to h5 and target the h-pawn. And this is not super easy for white to deal with. Like if h4, my intention was to play g5, and the king side is kind of opening up. And of course, on rook h5, if e5, then I have bishop takes h3, where white doesn't really have time to take on f6 because bishop takes g2 is very dangerous, but I also just have bishop f5 check, winning the queen. Instead, my opponent, I think, found the best resource here, which I definitely underestimated when I went for all this. And he goes rook takes d7, sacrificing the exchange, but a very, very good sacrifice because my attack on the king side is totally shut down without this light square bishop. And after rook d1, queen to c8, my rook on h5 is now, of course, a completely terrible piece because it has no squares. It's in danger of getting trapped, and it just can't get back into the game because it's stuck on the king side. So here my opponent played queen e2, which I think was the best move. The idea here is to cover the g4 square, so not make it super easy for me to get any kind of tricks with knight g4 or anything like that. And yeah, here I went into the tank. Thankfully, I still had, a decent amount of time, so I'm not like in time trouble just yet. But yeah, I found this position very, very difficult to play because it's like, what does black even move? I can't move my queen because I dropped the c7 pawn. I didn't want to play c6 because that allows knight to d6, which I thought is also bad. It's really hard to get the rook into the game. I'm basically reduced to just like waiting moves, like a4 or something like that. But white is ready to play either e5 here and eventually g4, just going after the rook. Knight d5 is another idea where white's pieces just start to dominate. And yeah, so this, I had a very, very hard time just finding a move in this position. So it turns out the right move was c6 here, which the point being allows me to actually get my rook on a8 into the game. So I didn't want to allow knight d6, but after queen to e6, there's a couple things I didn't realize. Number one, of course, my rook gets in, which is nice, but more importantly, I actually do have some serious threats now with knight g4 check followed by bishop to d4. Which earlier was not possible because this knight is covering the d4 square, but now this actually becomes quite annoying for white to deal with, and the position is just extremely unclear. But that was kind of the only way to play the position, which shows you that it was quite difficult. I ended up making this move king h8, which essentially is kind of just trying to improve my position. There were some lines where I run into like knight d5, knight e7 check, and yeah, some checks that the king has to deal with. So I thought this would just help. But basically it shows how difficult the position was because there was only kind of one way to really play it. Now white played e5, which actually I was hoping to see because this allows me to break out a bit. I go knight g4 check, king drops back to g1, and I can take on e5 here, give back some material, but at least break my rook out, break my dark square bishop out, and introduce some life into my position, which was desperately needed. Instead of e5, I think knight d5 here was maybe the simplest for white, with the idea if I take, c takes d5, white's pawns are extremely strong, my rook is still trapped, I have no way to kind of do anything on the king side, and it's not over yet, but it looks like a very, very bad position for black. So e5, I'm able to escape a bit here. Rook takes e5, queen f3. Good move, hitting b7 and f7. And here I lamented playing king h8 because now the f-pawn ends up hanging. But what to do? It's just very hard to find a move back then. But I didn't think I was in an insane amount of trouble here. I actually thought it's kind of okay. I now have a rook and a couple pawns for 2 knights. So the material is somewhat balanced. And unfortunately, I do have to give up material back. So rook f5 I played. Queen takes b7. I trade queens. And here I played rook to e8. And white plays king to g2. And I wasn't sure how to evaluate this position. My first instinct is that white either has a large advantage, maybe even winning with best play, or at least a small advantage. It was hard. After the game, we analyzed this one a bit, and we really weren't sure whether white has significant winning chances or not. But in this position, I actually missed just a very, very simple option. I just completely overlooked it. Bishop takes c3. So I think I just didn't even notice that this move was possible. It's not my instinct to give up the king's Indian bishop, especially when white has 2 knights, but it's just a tactical thing. After bc3, I have rook e2 check, and I'm winning the a-pawn. So this actually I think would be just very bad for white because now this a-pawn is super strong, and my rooks, of course, are extremely active. But if white takes with the knight, then I get rook to b8, and I'm winning the b2 pawn. So here I think black is at least okay. I don't think black has a big advantage or anything, but black is at least fine, and the game continues. Probably all 3 results are possible. Instead I played h5, which just felt like a useful move because I missed this kind of tactical idea. Bishop e4, rook e5, bishop f3, I drop back. I was definitely feeling very, very uncomfortable here. Like white has this grip with the 2 pieces, bishop c6, rook to b8. Kind of just felt like I'm just barely holding on, just trying to put some pressure here. And yeah, I really wasn't happy with my position. So rook d2, I go rook e6, hitting the bishop, intending maybe some c6. White played bishop to d5, I drop back rook e7, inviting a repetition, which my opponent, he spent some time, and eventually he does decide to repeat. So bishop c6, rook e6, and we ended up making a draw like this. Bishop d5, rook e7, bishop c6. And during the game, I had mixed feelings about this result. Of course, being the high rated player, I wanted to kind of play on and try to push for a win. But objectively, I felt like, I would definitely just rather be white in this position. I didn't know if white is like winning or much better, but I really felt like if anyone has chances, it should be white. Of course, white also has many ways to go wrong and mess up. And I think that's why my opponent decided to go for the draw. Afterwards, we were analyzing. We couldn't find like anything super convincing for white here. But okay, I'll save you guys some time. The engine thinks it's about +2. So white just has like a huge advantage, probably winning with best play. Key idea here is that white has knight a4 coming and going after the c-pawn. And yeah, if white can keep this grip and black doesn't get any real counterplay, then it should be just a losing endgame for black. But yeah, I don't know. We both felt like it definitely wasn't that easy. In fact, maybe just unclear. But okay, probably I got a little bit of I am privileged to be able to hold this game. But given the fact, I showed up like 40 minutes late, I misplayed the position, I was definitely not upset about drawing this game. In fact, I definitely felt like I got away with one here. Okay, going on to round 3. In this game, I was back to playing whites, and I was playing a Spanish player this time, Albert Ezquerro. And yeah, I go for d4, knight f6, and bishop g5, the Trompowsky, d5, knight to d2. A couple years ago, I recorded a YouTube video on this channel where I dubbed this variation the Tromp wall attack because it's a Trompowsky, aka the Tromp. And generally the idea is to play for e3 and eventually even play for f4 if allowed in kind of a stonewall fashion where white tries to establish the knight on e5. And later, actually, I would get this kind of stonewall setup in another game. In this game, however, I don't quite get there. Black plays, I think, one of the more principal continuations with c5 and knight c6. And we eventually just get this kind of exchange Karo structure, or you can also call it a reverse Carlsbad. It's a very solid position for black. It's about equal, but it's a very playable position, so I didn't mind getting this. So knight e4, bishop f4, takes, bishop takes d2, e6, bishop to d3. And here I already had a trick in mind that ends up happening in this game. Of course, I realized black could play this move queen f6 here, which is kind of annoying, threatening to double the pawns. But my idea was to play bishop to g5 in this position, which is a pretty thematic tactic. The point being, if bishop takes f3, where it looks like black is winning a piece, white is a very nice response, queen to d2. So if you haven't seen this tactic before, this is a very, very good one to keep in mind because it does show up in many kinds of positions. And as you can see now, black's queen is trapped and white is winning. Bishop g5, though, doesn't win the game. Black can bail out here with queen takes g5. And then after knight takes g5, bishop takes d1, rook takes d1. Material is equal. I would say this endgame is very, very close to just being dead equal, but it's still a playable position. And of course, I would try to play and push for the full point. Though just for accuracy, I should mention here that instead of bishop g5, in this exact position, queen b3 is much stronger, just hitting b7, which is a huge, huge threat for black to deal with. But yeah, my idea was to go bishop g5. In any case, black goes bishop d6. I played castles, and I was expecting my opponent to castle here, but he decides to play h5, which is very aggressive and definitely an interesting idea. I mean, I understood immediately that if I play h3 here, he's not taking on f3. He's just going to leave the bishop on g4 and play this kind of like fishing pole type of attack. But I didn't totally believe it. So I went h3. Queen f6 I thought is a very logical reaction here. And yeah, now if I take this one, I don't think I can really successfully deal with the incoming counterplay on the h-file. Black is threatening to take the knight. And just one key variation, for example, is if I go bishop to g5, black can take the knight on f3. And if I take on f6, bishop h2 check, black has a draw by perpetual and can just repeat and yeah, draw the game. So, of course, I wanted more than a draw at this point, and I decided to play bishop g5 right away. And I think black only has one way to play at this point. They got to take on g5 here and go for this endgame after bishop takes d1, rook takes d1. And black is totally fine here. I think h4 would be a nice move to kind of fix white's kingside. If anything, maybe black is even just a tiny bit better here. I was willing to play the position. I didn't think I have anything serious here, but of course, you know, that's chess. Game continues, you know, you try to win. But to my surprise, after bishop g5, my opponent took on f3, and afterwards he admitted he just totally missed my idea here, which was to play queen d2. And luckily for black, it's not lost. He does have a way out with the move bishop to f4. Otherwise, the queen is just trapped. But with bishop f4, black can at least keep the material balance. And yeah, I thought about for a little while how to take, but eventually I realized that the endgame I thought was simpler. Bishop takes f4 was also possible, but my point here after queen f4, takes, black is forced to play bishop e4. And I realized I can just trade bishops here and go after this e-pawn, and that this would actually be very, very unpleasant for black. Actually, with rook fe1, I already calculated quite deeply here. I expected f5 because, okay, you know, feel like you got to defend the pawn. But now f3, white is opening up the e-file, takes, and I took on e6 here, king f7. And when I was calculating this, you know, my first thought was like rook to d6, where I'm threatening rook d7 check, as well as just winning back, or actually getting an extra pawn with g takes f3. If fg2, then I can give this check and take this pawn, and then this pawn is never going anywhere, so white will have an extra pawn, and to me would look like a completely winning endgame where I now have a bunch of passed pawns on the queen side, and the bishop I think is very, very strong compared to the knight on c6. But as I was calculating from afar, I realized, you know, I have a lot of options here. d5 is also possible, but I ended up going, I think, the simplest route, just rook a e1, which I was happy to find. And the point now is, once again, I'm threatening to just get a clean extra pawn with g takes f3. But if f takes g2, then I can play d5, kicking the knight, and of course, giving my rooks access to the 7th rank, which is very, very I think, good for white. So like knight a5, for example, rook e7 check, and the second rook can come in. The bishop is coming to e5. The knight on a5 is very far from the game. I have the super strong d-pawn, and yeah, I evaluated this endgame as just completely winning. So after rook a1, I think it's basically lost for black. He tries what I kind of expected, rook e8, where he's able to get into a bishop versus knight endgame. But after g takes f3, white is just a clean pawn up. And I've already created a couple passed pawns in the position. So I have one already, but I have potential for two on the queen side. So I felt like this should be a pretty straightforward win. And it ended up being not that difficult, actually. So I'll just quickly play through the rest of the game. b5. I bring the king in to d3. And my plan is very simple. I just want to play b3, c4, and create two connected passed pawns, which is generally just going to be a winning advantage in these kinds of endgames. And yeah, there really wasn't much that black could do here. I think the rest of the game just kind of played itself out in a very straightforward fashion. So knight g6, d5. I just start running my pawns up the board. Knight h4, c5, c6. And here I realized I don't even need to deal with the f pawn. The two pawns on the queen side can just win the game on their own. So check, bishop a5 check, and yeah, it was time to resign because d7, d8 is coming. Everything is with check, and it's game over. So I was pretty happy with this game. Again, not a perfect game. Actually, I'll just show you guys one interesting moment back after queen f6. Like I mentioned, after bishop to g5, black could have just bailed out with queen takes g5 and going for this endgame that's just completely equal. So the interesting thing here is that the best try for white, or I think the best move for white, would have been to play queen to c1 in this position, which I can tell you I did not consider during the game. I did consider bishop g5, bishop takes f3, and then queen c1 here, in case it makes some difference, on this bishop f4, my queen's on c1 rather than d2. I think it amounts to being the same thing, but yeah, I didn't take the extra step to actually think about queen to c1 here, where the point is black doesn't have this option to bail out with queen takes g5. So I'm threatening bishop to g5, trapping the queen. And after bishop takes f3, bishop g5 anyway. Black again has to play bishop f4. And then we get the position that we got in the game, which I think was very, very good for white, but without allowing, black's option to go queen g5 earlier. So that was kind of a nice detail that, the very smart stockfish pointed out to me. Okay, so that was round 3. At this point, I'm on 2.5 out of 3. And moving on to round 4, I play my first grandmaster of the event, GM Pranav Anand from India. Young kid, I think he's about 17 or maybe 18 years old. And yeah, this was a tough game. As I mentioned, I was already starting to feel sick over the last couple of days. I feel like this was the day where, I was kind of just feeling the most like symptoms, like my throat was bothering me, my nose and stuff. So I definitely didn't feel like I played my best in this game, but it happens. So we got the Rossolimo. Normally I play g6 in this position, but for this game I decided to try knight f6, which is another system that's very playable here. White took on c6, dc, plays d3 here, and I go g6. So we essentially transpose into these g6 systems anyway, but white has kind of fewer options than if I were to just play g6 on move 3. And yeah, we end up following some theory for some time. Knight d7, bishop e3, e5. This line, if you guys remember, was featured in the first game of the Carlsen-Caruana World Championship match back in 2018, where Carlsen was playing a lot of these Sveshnikov, Rossolimo setups with black. And so yeah, I end up going for like just a very normal setup here. Castles, queen e7. I think maybe b6 is also maybe the main line. Knight h2. This is all very normal. Knight f8, f4, takes, knight e6. Black brings the knight to d4. Bishop e3, knight d4. And here my opponent played knight to d1. At this point, I was basically out of book. I think this was pretty much the end of my theory. Bishop goes to e6. Black maybe plays b6 at some point. Black can castle queenside possibly. And overall, it's a very, I would say, difficult position for both sides. I mean, it's really not easy, I think, to play. So knight d1, of course I understood the idea is to try to play c3 and kick the knight off of d4, so I wasn't totally sure about playing bishop e6 here. I ended up playing b6, c3, knight e6, white goes knight f2. I played a5 to put the bishop on a6 without blocking the a-pawn, also restricting some of white's b4 ideas. Knight f3, bishop a6. Here white should have probably played just e5 immediately, and I think white is doing quite well here with a nice advantage. Instead he played rook to b1 with what I understood the intention being to play for b4. But this allows black to play rook to d8, and now if white does go for b4, I have all these tactics with bishop takes d3 followed by c4. So this is a tough position. I mean, my king is on e8. You know, I'm underdeveloped because this h6 pawn is hanging. I can't castle without giving up the pawn. But I do think in this position, black would be doing quite all right here because a lot of material is coming off and a lot of white's pawns remain weak. My pieces are good. And at some point, I will be able to castle and just get my last rook into the game. And I think everything should be fine. So white ends up going rook b d1. Kind of admitting his mistake, admitting that rook b1 is not fast enough because of these bishop takes d3 tactics, and he instead just reinforces the d pawn. And of course, my first thought here was, well, I can take on d3 anyway, but I end up deciding against this because I really just wasn't sure what's happening in this position. Like bishop takes b6, rook takes d3. And I feel like I kind of stopped short here because in my mind, I was just like, okay, I get my pawn back, but all my queenside pawns are weak. You know, queen c2, I'm going to lose the d file. And I just didn't like it. But it turns out like black is actually kind of fine here if you keep going. Like queen c2, I think castles is the simplest. And if white takes the pawn on d3, I have rook b8 at the end. I'm trying to get in the rook takes b2. I think if I really push myself to calculate a little further, I could have recognize that this is not dangerous for black at all, and black is in fact fine here, and of course I would have gone for this. But the interesting thing is actually, okay, bishop takes b6 is not white's best option. The engine wants to play knight fe5 here, which I don't know if this was my opponent's idea or not. I certainly was not considering this move at all. But white ends up getting quite some nice compensation for the queen. They have a rook and bishop against a queen and pawn. So black is definitely up material, but rook d7 is a very annoying threat. f7 is hanging. And after castles, knight g4, the engine says things are equal if I find the move f5 here, allowing white to take on h6, take on f5. And okay, Compy says it's equal, but clearly it's an incredibly sharp position. I think all three results are possible. Black has a queen, but my king is open. White's pieces are active. I don't know. Optically, I still kind of feel like maybe white is the one with the easier game, but definitely a position I'll have to analyze more because, yeah, it just looks very, very unclear overall. So that said, I absolutely had to play bishop takes d3. Like I mentioned, I ended up deciding against it, and instead I play this move king f8, basically just trying to castle by hand, bringing the king to h7. But this just ends up being very slow, and now white is able to just kind of totally fix his position. So queen c1 getting off of the d file, king g8, e5, king h7, rook e1. Now I felt like, I don't know, somewhat happy because I at least connect my rooks and get my last rook into the game. But it turns out white's position is just actually very, very good here. So rook d7, he goes c4, shutting down the bishop on a6, rook d8, knight to g4, now going after the h6 pawn, h5, and now I think a very strong move, bishop to g5, where black's position starts to collapse. So of course he's hitting my queen, he's hitting the rook, and if I take on g5 here, I really didn't like the looks of knight takes g5 followed by e6. To me, this just looked really, really bad. I actually think this was the best chance. My opponent said, you know, I probably should have gone for this anyway. But yeah, it looked like I'm just losing here. It's probably not that easy after hg. Let's say white takes on d7, queen takes d7. I think I can still fight being down the exchange, but objectively white should be doing very well here. But yeah, that looked bad to me. So instead I decided to do something extremely risky. But at this point I just felt like I'm kind of lost no matter what I do. So, might as well try something interesting. And I decided to take on g4 and sacrifice a lot of material here. So bishop takes e7, g takes f3, bishop takes d8, and now rook takes d8. And the material we end up getting is I have 3 minor pieces for a queen and rook, which almost always is not enough. It's just white is just way up in material. But my idea here is like I'm trying to play for some fortress type of stuff, like bishop can come to h6, knight can come to d4. Maybe I'll have time to bring my bishop back to e6, f5. All in all, I mean, I wasn't pretending like I'm surviving this position. My only idea was that maybe this is not that easy for white. And okay, if he does mess up, blunder something, yeah, maybe I can get some chances. But of course, this didn't happen. My opponent played quite well here. He goes rook e4, take on g2, takes, and now of course he's stopping bishop h6 because of rook h4. So I bring this guy back, bishop c8, rook f1, king g8. Now white goes h4, and he's ready to just open up the king side with h5. And it doesn't look obvious like how white is going to break through, but basically at some point white can give back a rook for one of my pieces, open things up, and the queen of course is going to be very, very strong if the situation ever opens up. So here I made one final blunder. I took on d3, not realizing actually my opponent has this covered with the move rook takes f7, where if I take back, then there's queen f1 check and winning my rook. And then of course, okay, I'm not defending with these pieces. So this was basically all over. Knight d4, and my opponent just kind of cleaned up very nicely here. Takes, rook e3, trading off my rook, and now queen for 2 pieces. Maybe if there were no pawns on the board, you can sometimes hold that position, but here there's just too many entry squares for white's queen to get in, and he just has too many ideas. So bishop e6 and queen g5, and I resigned here because, yeah, the queen there's h5 for one. The queen is also getting in to devour the queen side, and there's just no hope whatsoever of a fortress or anything like that. So kind of a tough game. I did have one chance with this bishop takes d3 that I definitely just should have gone for better or worse. But otherwise, I think my opponent just played a very, very good game regardless. So that was round 4. At this point, I'm on 2.5 out of 4 going into round 5. I was paired against WFM Vishwa Shah, also from India. And this game I was quite happy with. We play a Slav line where white sacrifices 1 pawn, but gets some nice play in the center. And we actually follow a game between Carlsen and Hare Krishna for some time, where black gives back the pawn, but is able to kind of mobilize their pieces, collect the bishop pair. And I wasn't aware of this game. At this point, I'm pretty well out of book. I just thought it's a normal position that white could play. But it's interesting that both me and Carlsen played this move knight to c3, which I was happy to see. I don't think it's definitely not the best move in the position, but it did feel like this move poses some issues for black, because my idea here is I'm threatening to play e5, and then after knight d5 I can trade on d5, and then after e d5 I think that structure is kind of nice for white because I get this kingside majority. I can also play bishop g5 and try to trade off the dark squared bishops, and play knight against light squared bishop, which I think gives white some chances. Now this one is actually not good because black can play b4, which doesn't seem like a move black wants to play, which is why I think this move is hard to find, because after knight a4 it looks like white gets some squares. But it turns out after queen to b8, black is doing quite well here. Bishop to b5 is a threat, and yeah, black is at least okay, maybe even could be slightly better in this position. Instead, my opponent played queen b8 first, which is very reasonable because now it's like threatening b4 and bishop to b5. But this gives white time to do exactly what I wanted to do with e5. So I think that was definitely a mistake. Now after knight d5, I take, e takes d5, bishop to g5. I think black probably should have just avoided the trade with bishop to b4 here, but okay, position I think is at least slightly better for white. Instead, my opponent took on g5, knight takes g5, and plays h6, which is very logical. Otherwise, it's hard for black to castle with h7 hanging. But I think she kind of underestimated my idea here, because after h6, I don't have to go back with the knight. I have this kind of nice shot with e6 that I was happy to find. So the point here is that the king is opening up, right? So if fe6, then queen g6 check, looks like trouble. White's pieces are getting in. And if bishop takes e6, then I can trade on e6, queen g6 check, and I'm winning back one of the pawns. And the resulting position, I think, is very difficult for black because we're going to have a heavy piece endgame where black's king is very unsafe, white's pieces are stronger, black has lots of weaknesses on the board. And yeah, I felt like it should just be practically very, very difficult for black. So after e6, black takes on g5. This was definitely the best try. E takes d7. And definitely black should have just played king takes d7 here, just take the pawn. Although it looks like the king is wide open, black does get a tempo because h2 is hanging. So I have to take a timeout to play like h3 or g3. I think my opponent didn't want to allow like queen f5 check. And yeah, some position like this. To me, this still looks very, very pleasant for white because I'm probably going to win back one of the pawns. And then my pieces are, more active, very easily centralized. My king looks safer, black can't castle, and so on. The engine thinks it's like not that bad, like black can hold, but okay, clearly both players felt that this would have been difficult for black. Nevertheless, 100% black should have taken on d7. Instead, she played king f8, which is understandable because the king feels safer, but the issue is that this d pawn is still alive. And it poses black some really, really serious problems because it's going to take black time to defend, to take the pawn. And it's not even that easy to win it because I have queen f5, the rooks can come in, I'm putting pressure. And so white has a lot of tactical resources in the position using this pawn. So g3, important not to blunder mate in one. Queen d6 was played. And basically I already spotted the trick that ends up happening in this game, but I think the position was very difficult for black nevertheless. So queen takes b5. Now my first nice idea here is that if rook to b8, I was going to meet this with rook fe1, which I thought was a nice trick, playing for rook e8 checkmate, which is actually just a very, very difficult threat to deal with nevertheless. And yeah, we can see the power of this d-pawn. Instead, black played queen h6, which I was also kind of anticipating. And I already noticed kind of a nice trap here. So h4. G takes h4. It looks like my king is opening up, but white is still in time here. Queen takes d5, I think, looks like the obvious move. This was definitely my first instinct when calculating this position, forcing black to play like rook to d8, and then it looks like, okay, white should be doing well, but eventually I spotted queen takes a5, which is a nice move, and kind of just ends the game immediately. Of course, if rook takes a5, there's d8 equals queen with mate. But I'm also just threatening to promote regardless because my queen is covering the square, and it's just game over. Like, yeah, I'm just promoting, winning at least a rook, and yeah. So this forced resignation because black just doesn't have a clear way to continue the game. And yeah, I was pretty happy with this one. I felt like, okay, opening wasn't perfect, but I found some nice ideas with this e6, queen takes a5, and yeah, felt like it was a nice win overall. So that leads us to round 6, where I was paired against Grandmaster Krishnan Sasikiran, also from India, and definitely a legend from a while back. He's been around for many years. It used to be, I think, either very close to 2,700 or even above 2,700. So super strong player. Earlier, my co-sensei on this channel, David Pruis, he actually faced Sasikiran in round 2 of this tournament, ended up drawing that game also with black. So that gave me a little bit of hope for this game that, I wasn't just going to get completely blown off the board. But of course, I was expecting, a very, very difficult game. And yeah, he goes for knight f3. I decide to switch it up and play e6 here. He goes for the open Sicilian. I play knight c6, knight c3, and a6. So this is kind of like a hybrid system between the Taimanov and Khan Sicilians. I actually don't know the official name for this. I don't know. In my mind, I call it Paulson, but yeah, I don't know what exactly it's supposed to be called. All these names are very, very confusing. In any case, it's a playable system. He goes for queen to d3, which is one of the trendy options these days. I definitely wasn't super well prepped here, but I do something normal. Knight takes d4, queen takes d4, b5. This is pretty typical. And yeah, I'd say the game progresses in a natural way. Bishop f4, bishop b7, castles, knight f6, f3. I played rook to c8. And now my opponent plays bishop to d6. And this is kind of a logical idea. He's trading off the dark squared bishops and trying to kind of fix the d6 square. And I really wasn't sure how to evaluate this position. I already started to feel like I was about to suffer for a long time. So I started spending time. I wasn't sure how to deal with this. I ended up taking on d6 and going queen to c7. And yeah, bishop e2, he just kind of keeps the pressure. I didn't feel like I have much of a choice, so I take, rook takes d6, and we get this endgame. And yeah, long story short, I basically just kind of underestimated my position here, maybe overestimated my opponent's chances. I kind of thought like, ooh, I'm already worse, I'm under pressure, e5 is coming. It turns out it's probably like not that bad for black if I just play like bishop c6. Of course, I considered this, but what I didn't like is e5, let's say knight g8, for example, knight e4. I really don't want to take this knight because then after fe, my queen side just gets decimated by white's rook and bishop and a4 break. But I don't have to take. I can play knight e7. And optically, I wasn't sure about this because, what if the knight gets to d6? That would be really bad. But as soon as the rook moves out of the way, of course, I can just snap on e4 and avoid that fate. And otherwise, my knight is coming to d5, maybe even f5. It turns out I think black is actually just totally fine in this position. But yeah, during the game, it was just difficult for me to evaluate this. So I go rook c6, trying to just challenge white's rook. But now, very nice move by my opponent, rook to d4, which I was not expecting, where he just avoids the trade. He leaves my pieces looking rather silly. And now a4 is coming, and my queen side is definitely under pressure, and so I'm just not in time to really develop fully. I played d6, the point being to try to bring the knight to d7 and c5. And now the engine points out, actually, white could have just taken on b5 here. I'm not sure if my opponent considered this one. I feel like he played a4 without taking a ton of time. But I can tell you guys, I did not think, I'm not even sure I realized this was a move, to be honest. Like, thinking back to the game, I'm not sure if I remember calculating like knight takes b5, but white gets a rook and 2 pawns for the 2 pieces in the endgame and has these like queenside pawns. So engine gives white a pretty serious advantage. I'm not sure if that's how my opponent would have evaluated this one. But yeah, this was clearly a very good option for white. In any case, he goes a4, which I think was more just kind of logical. I got to take on a4 because it's hard to hold the pawn. Rook b4, bishop c8. He takes, king e7. And now basically like the squeeze starts because I'm left with this weakness on a6. It's not the end of the world because it's just one weakness and I can defend it. But it's very, very unpleasant here because white can just double rooks on the a file and black essentially just doesn't have any counterplay. So I really start to suffer in this game because I have no play and I'm just trying to hold on. It's also hard to just complete my development. So I bring my king to... I try to bring my king to c7, and essentially my opponent just plays a very nice game, just like maneuvering, knight c4, rook a3, now b3, and it's just total like classic, endgame strategy, just squeezing. Again, it's very hard for me to break with d5 without just, creating more weaknesses, and I essentially just have to sit on my position, which is not fun. Knight b8 here, c3, rook b6. At some point, I just start moving back and forth. I'm in time trouble. Like I have no active moves, and generally in this situation I just kind of lash out and lose the game. But I was really trying to defend as stubbornly as I could and not make it easy for the opponent. So bishop b7, knight c4, rook c6, knight a5, rook b6, king e3, bishop c8, bishop d3, f6. I'm really just like running out of moves. Eventually I'm going to run out of pawn moves and just start to collapse. Knight c4 back. He repeats once to get closer to the time control. g3. I go rook d7, knight b3, rook to d8. At this point we reach move 40, so we get additional time. F4. Now I decide, okay, I got to bring my king back over to the king side because white is eventually going to play like g4, g5, open up a second front, and I'm going to need my king over there to defend. So knight a5, king e7, knight c4, rook c6, knight d2, rook b6, and g4. And okay, at this point, I had enough. Like I was just so tired of like moving back and forth with no prospects. I just felt like, okay, I can keep shuffling and doing nothing, but white's going to play knight f3, g5, bring the rook to the g file. And I just felt like there's no way I'm holding this in the long run. So I decided to take my chance. I played d5. I just felt like I might not get a better opportunity to do this. My point is that if ed5, then okay, I'm hitting the g pawn, which is important, and I'm threatening d4 check, which would at least give me some play by breaking up white's pawns, opening up my pieces, then I can come out to c6 and so on. But of course, white doesn't have to take on d5. He plays knight b3, which is much stronger, bringing the knight to c5. And now I continue the desperation with e5. Takes, bishop takes g4. Essentially, I'm just trying to open up the position so maybe, my pieces can try to harass white's king a bit. But he actually played it very well. He goes knight c5, d takes e4, and now bishop takes a6. And finally, he wins his a pawn. He now has two connected passers on the queen side, and it's clear that white is about to break through when the rook gets to a7. So what to do? I played f5, just hoping that one day maybe my rook can get in and I'll have some counterplay against the king, though it's hard to imagine this happening. Bishop c4. Here I understood what is about to happen to me. Knight c6, rook a7 check. Very straightforward exchange sacrifice because my king, all my pieces end up just kind of bad and passive. Check, rook takes g7. Now white is ready to go e6. And the rook, knight, bishop, and pawn are all super strong. Of course, white has these passers as well. And it feels like I have some pawns too, but it's very difficult to figure out how to push them. And the rook on b6, I think, is just the biggest problem for black because it doesn't activate. It just has no squares. And truth be told, I was actually considering resigning here because I felt correctly that the position is completely lost. But I thought, okay, like, as long as I still have some chances, of course, I should keep playing. So I just made this move rook to d1 just kind of out of inertia. If allowed, I want to go rook h1, rook h3 check, or rook e1, or maybe rook c1 going after white's pawns. But I really didn't think that, this is going to work out. So e6, rook c1. Now, in addition to taking the pawn, I'm hoping for maybe some rook takes b4 ideas. Like if knight a4, my intention was to just take on b4 here, give back the exchange, but at least free my position a little bit. And this, I wasn't sure how to evaluate. It could just be lost for black anyway, but at least there's some counterplay. And at this point, we're starting to approach the second time trouble. So we don't have any more extra time. I think we're both down to about 10 minutes here, maybe a little bit less. My opponent definitely started spending time as he's trying to finish off the game smoothly. So he goes knight d7, which hits the rook on b6. I was actually kind of expecting king d4 here, followed by king e5 and king f6. But it is not that easy. I mean, black can play like e3 and try to do something with the e pawn. Where after king e5, e2, he can't quite go king f6 yet, because I think black can play king to d8 here, and it's kind of unclear because the e-pawn is pinned, so there's no e7 check. But white has a very nice win here with bishop b5 check. The point being, if I take, then now king f6 is just game over, which is a very kind of nice combination. But of course he's threatening mate. If I move the king, then there's e7, and white is promoting with check, and so I'm just not in time to promote my e-pawn. But okay, this is not easy to calculate, of course, with just less than 10 minutes on your clock. So knight d7 was played, which is still, I think, completely winning. Now he's hitting the rook. He's threatening knight f6 check, followed by e7, and promoting once again. So I essentially only have one chance here. I have to take on e6, bishop takes e6, and play f4. And so I was mainly expecting king takes f4, where I take on e6. I give back the exchange, and I'm just hoping that maybe my rook is active enough to create some counterplay. But I think the easiest here would have been knight f6 check, king f8, rook c7, where white defends the c pawn, keeps his two passers alive, and then this e pawn is likely going to be lost as well. And yeah, if he takes this one, then I'm just 2 pawns down for no compensation, and should be a pretty straightforward win for white. Instead, he went king d2, which is also totally winning, but the game continues. So bishop takes e6. I have to because all my pieces are hanging. So I take on e6, king takes c1, and bishop takes d7. And from afar, I actually did think this position is not simple for white because, okay, he's obviously up in the exchange and should be winning. But these 2 pawns are no joke. Like, and if the pawns start moving, then it could be dangerous for white. But he did have a pretty simple way to just kind of kill all the counterplay just by playing king d2 immediately. And I'm not sure exactly why he decided against this one. Maybe it was this move bishop to b5. That was kind of my intention in the game. If I give e3 check right away, then king f3, or king e2, king goes to f3, my pawns are stuck. Rook can come back to g1, and I'm just dead lost. So my intention was probably to play bishop to b5 here, playing for like e3, f3, f2, and then, okay, the pawn can promote. But it just doesn't work out tactically. White has rook g4. And if I give check, king e1, and f3, he has rook e4 check, which is a very important resource, but ends the game because he takes this pawn, and that's it. Game over. So that would have been, I think, the easiest way to win. He goes c4, which is definitely kind of surprising for me because now I feel like, well, okay, my pawns are faster, and now it's like hard for his king to get in time. And luckily for me, my opponent was actually just in very heavy time trouble. At this point, he's like down to maybe 2 minutes, and this is a really difficult position to calculate, I think, for anyone, you know, just with not a lot of time, the pressure of the situation, and so on. So white here is actually still holding, but he goes b5, which actually lands white in some trouble. And I already realized this trick ahead of time because I can play f3 here. And I think I noticed from his body language that he actually understood, like, uh-oh, like something's happening. Because it looks like, okay, rook g3, he's picking up one of the pawns, and it's game over. If e2, then king d2, the pawns are stuck. And if f2, of course, he can take with check and bring the rook back to f3, and the pawn is lost. But I have a very nice move, bishop to g4, which I think he just noticed too late. And unfortunately for white, actually, it's now very hard because f2 is threatened, and this rook is just not able to stop the f-pawn. So with not a lot of time, he ends up taking the bishop, like nothing else to do. Black plays f2, and now the pawns are promoting. Now e2 is coming, and black is getting a new queen. And I was like shocked during the game. Even when I played like bishop g4, I was still thinking in my mind, like, oh, he's probably seen something, like I'm missing some resource, you know. But no, and he takes on g4, and I realized, oh my god, I might be winning now because I'm getting a queen. So rook f4, e2, he gives check, king d2, f1 equals queen, rook takes e2. I still had like 5-6 minutes here, so I had basically a good amount of time to kind of collect myself and adjust to the situation. Because for 4 hours, basically, I'm just losing this game, just like suffering. He's squeezing me, he's breaking through, he's completely winning. Now all of a sudden I'm here, I have a queen versus rook, and I realize, okay, clearly I'm never losing this game, but at this point, you know, I have to try to win. So luckily for me, I can immediately pick up the h-pawn with queen f4 check and queen takes h4. I think this is important. And now with the h-pawn being alive, I think it's just basically hopeless for white because it takes a very long time to organize any counterplay with the queenside pawns. Black's queen is obviously much, much stronger than the rook, and this h-pawn is going to run very, very fast. And thankfully, you know, not too long before this event, I think, you know, last couple of months or so, I forgot exactly when we did it, but I was sparring a lot with Grandmaster Jesse Cry, the other sensei on this channel. And we played a lot of these queen versus rook positions out. So first we started with just queen versus rook pure. Then it's like queen versus rook and one pawn. And we sparred it a lot. And it was actually very, very helpful in this situation. Because number one, I got a lot of experience playing queen versus rook. And I intuitively felt like, just how strong the queen is, how difficult it is for the rook and king to actually deal against the queen, but also gave me a lot of confidence that if black or white somehow managed to get down to just pure queen versus rook endgame, I was pretty sure I could convert it. It's not easy to convert against an engine, but I think it's very difficult to defend for most humans, because it's hard to find all these engine defensive moves. And I was familiar with a number of ideas about how to convert these endgames. If you guys want help, actually Jesse did a very, very good video. I think he calls it the jab method. You can search for it on our channel, where he explains kind of his process of converting queen versus rook. And yeah, it's very, very helpful to give yourself a sense of like how to actually play this endgame. So yeah, all that endgame sparring definitely gave me the confidence that I needed, because of course I was very nervous. I realized I'm winning now and I just need to like focus, not blunder anything and convert. But I think I ended up doing a pretty straightforward job here. So h5, c5, I went for queen e1 check. Actually, I think maybe the simplest would have just been queen to g4, keeping white's king cut off and then just running the h pawn. And then it's just very, very hard for white to advance. Like if check, then I can go king b7, for example, and white doesn't have rook d7 to try to keep making progress. So the h pawn is just running and white's rook and pawns are kind of stuck here. Instead, I tried to do it all with check. So check, queen e4, and give another check here. I put white's king on b4, and now I push h4. Of course, he can't take because of queen e1 check. These kinds of tactics are sometimes important in these endgames. And now the h pawn is just running. So check, king c8, rook d6. I went h3. And here I essentially calculated already that c6 is not going to be enough for white. So queen f4 check, king c5. Originally, I was actually just going to play queen e3 here, where I hit the b pawn. And if king b5, there's queen e5, winning the rook. So white has to play rook d4 to like keep his material, but then h2, and that's it. I'm getting the new queen. But then once I got here, I realized actually queen e5 is also winning, maybe even faster. It's hard to choose between multiple wins, but I felt this was straightforward enough, because now the point is after rook d5, I'm in time to just give the queen back. And after king takes d5, h2, white's not in time here. I'm promoting with check. If king d6, I promote. And b7, king b8, and white's a tempo too slow here to get their own queen. So black wins. And yeah, after queen takes d5, my opponent he just immediately paused the clock and resigned. And yeah, actually I want to say he was very, very gracious in defeat. Of course, I could tell he was upset during the game that he blundered away just a completely winning position, especially against like lower rated player. This is always difficult, but full credit to him. I mean, he was a total gentleman after the game, even started analyzing with me a little bit. And yeah, so ended up being a very, very nice result. Of course, it's always exciting to defeat such a strong grandmaster, especially with black. I wasn't like happy, with how the game went. I obviously felt I got extremely lucky that I just managed to have a chance, in the time trouble. And my opponent ended up going wrong. But yeah, I felt like, I was defending. I was really trying to be as stubborn as possible. And sometimes things do work out in your favor when you really just try to maximize your chances and your resources as much as you could. And I was happy that I didn't, nervously blunder away the winning endgame after the situation turned. So going to round 7, I'm now on 4.5 out of 6. Having a very nice event. I was paired against another grandmaster here, Andreas Kelires from Greece. I actually met Andreas earlier in the event. We kind of became friends. So it was a little bit unfortunate that we ended up playing in this round, but so be it. For this game, I decided to play e4. And the main reason I did this was because my opponent is mainly a Najdorf player. And so rather than banging my head against the wall, playing d4, looking for advantage there, I decided let's try to play e4 and have some fun against the Najdorf. I do enjoy the open Sicilian, so when I get a chance, I like to go into it. And here I play this move a3. This is a somewhat topical line where it's not that easy for black to deal with it, especially if they're not expecting it, so they're not prepared for it. So it can give white some interesting chances. But my opponent, I feel like he played the opening very well. So knight c6, I go bishop c4, Here the idea is that white is playing kind of like a Fischer or Sozin setup, but black is committed to knight c6, so he doesn't get the typical setups with like knight d7, e6, knight c5, and so on. And on knight a5, white does have this square for the bishop on a2. So bishop a2, e6. Here the opening I think was pretty straightforward. f4, castles, queen f3, queen c7. I castled here. And in this position, black goes king h8. Basically just a very useful move against white's main idea of pushing f5. This is, of course, white's plan in the position because otherwise the bishop on a2 is just completely dead. So you have to play f5 and hammer at this e6 pawn. And so king h8 is useful to get off of the diagonal. So rook a d1, black played b5. And this was definitely my first long think of the game. And yeah, immediately I just go wrong here, which kind of shows, my inexperience in these kinds of positions. What I should have done, I think, was f5 probably. What I didn't like is that after knight e5, black is getting knight c4, and it looks nice, but it's really not that easy. After queen h3, for example, if knight c4, white can take, queen takes c4, play bishop g5. I think I definitely overlooked or underestimated this idea. Because the point is white wants to play like rook f4, rook h4, and this actually could get kind of scary for black, if the rook lands on the h file. So maybe black has to play e5 here, white goes knight b3, but then I can fight for the d5 square. I have like bishop takes f6 ideas, and this I think actually be very, very playable for white. So I don't think actually f5, black should go knight e5. Probably simpler for black, or much simpler, is to go knight d4 and a5, and create some counterplay with b4. But the position seems to be about equal. White has some options here. I can play b4 myself. And I think black is totally fine, but at least white is also fine. So it would be a playable situation. Instead, I take on c6 here, which is kind of a normal idea in these positions. White takes, I put the bishop on d4. Now I want to play either f5 or like g4 or g5 and play for the kingside attack. But I totally just forgot, underestimated my opponent's counterplay as he goes a5 here. And yeah, had I anticipated this, I don't think I would have ever gone for this position, because now b4 is coming and the e-pawn is extremely weak. If I play b4, I'm not in time anymore because of takes, and knight takes e4, and black is winning the bishop on a2. And now black's rook and light square bishop are just extremely strong. I think this is probably just losing for white. So yeah, all of a sudden actually the position is extremely difficult because b4 is coming, and it's hard to defend the e-pawn, but it's also hard to just find a good square for my knight, because I don't want to go back knight b1. If I go rook e1, b4, knight e2, then e-pawn hangs again. And all of a sudden I felt like white is just in huge trouble here. So I started burning lots of time. I ended up going g4, which I felt like, if I'm losing, I might as well try to make things as sharp and complicated as possible. And now my point is I want to meet b4 with g5 to at least kick the knight away from f6 so I don't lose the e-pawn. And then I was kind of looking already, I don't know if knight e8 or knight d7 would be played, but I was basically already looking for this idea to go knight d5 to sacrifice the knight, where after takes, my idea would be to play, of course, against the king side. This kind of like thematic sacrifice. I want to play c4, bishop b1, go after the h7 pawn, maybe double rooks on the e file, maybe play for h4, h5, h6. And yeah, there's a very famous game, Tall Larson, where Tall won with a kind of similar sacrifice and structure. Of course, I think he had a much better version than I have here, but that was kind of my inspiration, what I was at least hoping to achieve. And these positions are never easy for black to defend, so basically I was just hoping to create some chances. Instead, my opponent played queen b7 first, which I think is totally fine. I went rook e1 defending the pawn, b4. I play g5 here, and he goes back knight e8. And of course I could play knight to b1 here and keep material alive, but yeah, we both felt that after knight c7, black is just doing extremely well. My pieces are bad, my kingside attack is going nowhere, knight to b5 is coming, and yeah, it just feels like black is clearly ahead. Objectively, I think this was the best thing to do and just try to fight on, but yeah, rather than just defend a bad position passively, I decided to go for it with knight d5. And to be fair, if black takes immediately here after takes, bishop can't go back to d7 because the e7 bishop will be hanging. So bishop b5, for example. My point would be to go c4, takes bishop b1. And this, okay, is not like the simplest position for black to defend because white is turning queen e4, hitting h7. You can't go g6 because of the pin. So computer, of course, defends here like f5, but queen h3, king g8, takes. It's really like, yeah, it's a very, very unclear position, I would say. So of course I would be happy to enter that, but instead my opponent finds a very strong move bishop to d8, which, okay, I was anticipating because he removes the bishop from attack and my knight on d5 is still trapped. And I don't have anywhere to go. If I drop back to e3, I lose the e-pawn. So I'm still committed to the piece sacrifice here, but black gets a much better version than if he were to take right away. So I went c4. I think this is just the most logical move where I'm just trying to support the knight on d5 and get ready to pull the bishop back to b1. He now takes. He basically kind of has to at some point. E takes d5, bishop d7. And unfortunately for me, black has this very nice idea to go bishop b6 and trade off the bishop. If I could get two moves here to play king h1 and bishop to b1, then maybe white would be getting somewhere because I have all these ideas with queen e4, queen d3, and going after the h-pawn. But if I play bishop to b1 here, then bishop to b6, I'm simply just not in time. Queen e4, he can trade, rook takes, and now he can go g6, and white's attack can get shut down very easily here, and I think it does. So I decided to take a move to play queen e3, stopping bishop to b6, and looking for some ideas like if the bishop comes out to f5 or g4, then queen takes e8. I can win back my piece. But even this, I think, is not good for white. Like bishop takes g5. I think black is the one on top here, but okay, at least that was the idea. Instead, black goes rook to b8, which I think is very straightforward and good, reinforcing the threat of bishop to b6. And there's really not much white can do here. Like I thought about this move, but black can just take and go bishop b6 anyway, or bishop b6 right away, force the endgame. And maybe it's not like the easiest endgame for black to convert because, they have to coordinate their pieces still, but black is a piece up for one pawn. I don't have any super obvious threats. I just have active pieces. I can make life difficult for black, but ultimately it should be completely losing for white. So I decided to go bishop b1 anyway. This is kind of the last chance. Bishop b6 and now queen e7. Black takes on d4, rook takes d4. There were some tricks left in this position. Of course, I'm threatening the rook. And if rook to g8, the idea would be to go bishop takes h7, where if king takes h7, then white has a very surprising g6 shot, which actually leads to mate. Like takes queen h4, or if king takes queen g5 check, and queen h7 mate, queen h5 mate. So, of course, that would never happen. After bishop takes h7, black doesn't even have to take the bishop, can go queen b6, and is winning here. But okay, at least there were still some hope left. Instead, king j was played, which I think is probably just much easier. This does allow me to win back some material, so I take on h7, queen takes f8. I now have rook and two pawns for the two pieces, so material-wise I'm doing fine. But now the problem is that black takes over with the counterplay. So queen a7, pinning the rook. I go rook to d1, bishop g4. My queen is actually trapped on f8. I have no moves. And after rook d3, rook d2, he takes on a3. Black's rook gets in, and basically it's all over here. Rook b2. And yeah, I'm just not in time to do anything. My pieces are hanging, and the king is very weak. The queen is about to come in. Maybe king f1 was the best try, but takes, queen e3. And it's just lost, bishop h3 now. And yeah, just losing material, and it's game over. So the game ended here. Rook takes b2, takes on d4, rook f2. My opponent found another very precise move, bishop h3. And now the threat of queen d1 followed by mate is essentially impossible to stop. So it was time to resign. Yeah, tough game. Sometimes it happens in the Open Sicilian. You basically make like one or two mistakes and it's all over. I think for me, the biggest mistake was just knight c6 in this position and allowing this counterplay with a5 that I just totally underestimated. And that was it. From here, I think black is already just like close to winning if they play well. And perhaps I could have defended a lot better, but yeah, it was already very, very difficult from this moment. So tough game, but okay, it happens. And clearly this is a game I need to analyze much more deeply to try and understand these middle games better. So going to round 8. In this round, I was paired against WGM Atousa Pourkashiyan, who is originally from Iran, but is now representing the US. And this is actually maybe this is definitely my shortest game of the event. She went for the Rossolimo. I repeated this line with knight f6. And now instead of taking on c6, she goes for a different line with knight c3, queen c7, castles, knight d4, rook e1. This is all fairly well-known theory. Black goes e5 here and just tries to get a grip on the d4 square. Bishop c4, bishop e7, knight d5 was played. I took, bishop takes, knight f3, queen takes, and castles. And I've had this position before, like in blitz and stuff. My impression is that I think white is better, but black is holding their own here. I'm just going to go d6 and bishop e6 next. And it's kind of passive for black, but I'm really not sure if white has anything more than just kind of maybe a small edge here. And it doesn't seem easy for white to really do much. Queen h5, g6, queen h6, d6. That said, it's also kind of difficult for black to play for a win, which I definitely wanted to in this game. But I should say Atousa at this point was actually having a very good event. She had already beaten some very strong players. So I really wasn't looking to take a ton of risk in this game because I didn't want to, again, just be punished, by... I often do this with black. I take too many risks against lower rated players and then I end up losing. So instead I decided, like, let's just be solid. If I get a chance, great. If not, draw is a normal result, especially with black, no problem. So bishop e6, she goes rook e3 here, intending to play rook h3, like on bishop takes d5, rook h3 would be very, very bad for black. But thankfully I can still defend. I have bishop f6, where h3 is covered, and if white takes on e6, fe, the queen opens up to cover h7. So I'm not really in any huge danger here on the king side. Bishop e6 was played. I took rook g3. I went queen g7, looking to kick white's queen back, queen h3, queen e7. And here actually we end up repeating moves quite quickly with bishop h6, bishop g7, and bishop to g5, which I was kind of anticipating because I felt like white can't really do a ton on the king side, especially in the structure. I have the f file and I am pretty solid. And I wanted to play on, but of course I can't really do much either here. Like bishop h6, I can play like rook f7, but I didn't really see what I'm doing in this position. Eventually I'm just going to have to go bishop g7 back anyway and try to target white's bishop. So I don't think black is like in a ton of danger here, but objectively I still think white is the one that's like kind of slightly better in this position. So I decided to repeat and we end up just making a draw here. So yeah, I guess neither one of us was really feeling confident that we could try to play this position for a win. I was definitely fine with this. At this point, actually, it's round 8, so I'm definitely pretty tired as far as the tournament goes. And I felt like, all right, one draw, get some extra rest and try to have a strong 2 final rounds. So yeah, I was more or less just fine with this result. So moving on to round 9, I was paired against WGM Ravi Rakshitta from India. And in this game, I once again go for the Trompowski. I don't remember exactly what made me choose the Tromp in this game, in the earlier game, as opposed to like d4, c4, or knight f3 or whatever. Just sometimes I feel like going for this one. so I play it. Knight d2, h6, bishop h4, d5, e3, knight d7. And here with black committed to knight d7, I decided to play f4. So here I'm going for the classic trump wall setup where the bishop is already out and I try to get the knight to e5 and play for the stonewall type of position. And I think it worked out quite nicely in this game. c5, c3, bishop e7, bishop d3. My opponent pushed c4, which is generally very risky to do in these positions because she it kind of shuts down the center, and it makes it hard for black to create counterplay. So bishop c2, b5. Logical, I played a3 to stop b4. Bishop to b7, knight f3. Now the problem for black is, knight is coming to e5, the other one is coming to f3, and it's just, difficult to deal with these knights. So my opponent here lashes out with g5, which is actually a pretty thematic idea. And if white does take on g5, then after knight e4, this actually could be quite bad for white, because black is ready to take back with the pawn, and then just gets a very, very active position. For example, take, knight d2, hg5, bishop g3, f5. I think black is actually doing really well. The knight can come to d5, and white is going to have problems. So instead I pull back bishop g3 right away, where now if knight e4, it's not as simple, because take, knight d2, I'm hitting the pawn, and if f5, I have queen h5 check. So this is the key difference between not taking on g5. I have this check, king f8, I can take on g5 here, black has to take with the bishop, and the structure here is very nice for white. And I'm sure I have a number of options here. I think the engine was suggesting h4, like sacrificing the e-pawn, but I'm not sure I'd go for this here exactly. But yeah, essentially it's a nice, very nice version for white. So instead, rook g8 was played, but now knight e5, and if felt like white is just getting everything that I would want. If takes, I can take back with the pawn and castle, eventually break with f5 to open up the bishop, and things look good. So black played g4, but now castles, and once again, I want to play f5 and play on the f-file, play on this diagonal. So even if black castles queenside, it's still going to be very dangerous. I can always open that up with a4, b3 as well. So already here, I feel like white's position is just very, very good. Black tried knight h5, which I was kind of expecting. I think it's very logical, but just doesn't quite work out. Knight takes g4, knight takes g3, hg. And black has sacrificed the pawn, and the idea is like to go for like h5 or f5, but it's just not in time. Like f5, I can take on h6, and I have queen h5 check coming, and that just looks really bad. If h5, I can also play knight h6 here. I was probably going to go knight e5 with the idea of like rook g3, queen takes h5, and just going after f7 here. If knight e5, fe5, black just can't hold this square. Rook g7, I have very typical tactic, rook takes, and rook f1. And white is breaking through. And the big problem for black in these positions is just the bishop on b7. It's just locked on the queen side, it's out of the game, and white just has an extra piece on the king side. So that was kind of my strategy here, is just kind of playing against this light square bishop. Black played bishop f8, covering the h6 pawn, but this gives white time to kind of develop my play. And I end up deciding on this move, king f2. Just defending the g pawn ahead of time with the king, and also opening up the h-file for the rook. Black played h5, knight e5, h4, playing for counterplay. But I like how I handled this part. I went queen h5 here. And now the point is after h takes g3 check, king e2. I give back my extra pawn, but I feel like my position strategically is just really, really nice. I have knight f3, knight g5 coming. Of course, this is hanging. My pieces are well placed. The rook can come into the h-file. My king is good. Eventually, I'll win this g-pawn. And again, the big problem for black is just this bishop on b7 is out of the game. So queen f6, knight f3, rook h8. Take on d7, hitting the queen. Knight e5 check. King e7 and just queen g5. I just felt like this was the simplest. If black trades, then fg opens up the rook. And there's no way to defend f7, so it's just losing. Or if king e8 won, I thought interesting line I calculated was queen g5 here anyway. Take, rook h2. It's going to take on f7 here. Let's say take, king f1. Rook takes c2, rook takes b7, and I evaluated this endgame as winning for white because my pieces are super active, and g6, g7 is just going to cost black a full piece. Instead, king e7 was played, queen g5, bishop g7. I just take the g-pawn. Now I'm ready to just bring my rooks to the h-file, and I have an extra pawn on the king side, but I also felt like I have an extra piece at this point. So rook g8, rook h1, bishop h6, queen f3. Now threatening like knight g4 and stuff. Queen g7, g4, playing for g5 and trapping the bishop. Queen f8, g5, bishop g7, and I think white has many good options, but bishop h7 to me looked like the easiest, just straight up winning the exchange. So bishop takes e5, I take, rook takes, bishop d6, and it was pretty straightforward here. I just pull my bishop out. b4, black is playing for some counterplay here, but bishop c2, g6, looking for rook h7 ideas, takes g7, and yeah, my opponent resigned here because it's all over. I'm just going to promote the g-pawn and yeah, win the game. So I was pretty happy with this one. Not a perfect game by any means. I'm sure I missed stuff, but I feel like the opening strategy was pretty solid, and I was pretty happy with how I handled the middle game, and the eventual conversion I thought was rather smooth. So I was happy to pick up another win, as this would be I think my 5th win of the tournament. Going on to the final game, I was paired against another Indian Grandmaster, GM Leon Luque Mendonca, and he's actually a young kid. I think he's about 17 years old, but very, very strong, already over 2,600. And this was definitely a pretty tough game, but an interesting one for sure. So he goes for the classical main line against the King's Indian, and I went with this h6 variation that's pretty trendy. He goes a3, knight d7. I don't think I played the opening in the best way, but I do reach a somewhat playable position here. So knight h7, he takes, bishop e3, c6, c5. I think all these moves are kind of very normal. b4, knight f6, he goes rook a d1. I take the chance to play bishop g4 and trade off my bishop. h3, take, knight g5, bishop e2, rook d8. And now black's plan, of course, is to play knight e6 and knight to d4. If I can establish the knight on d4, then I think black is doing fine. But this is easier said than done sometimes. Bishop c4, knight e6, and queen a2. And yeah, this was definitely at least one critical moment here. You know, white is looking to take on e6 and ruin my pawns, which I definitely did not want to allow. So I spent a little bit of time here, but I ended up just playing knight d4, which to me looked like the most obvious move. But I just completely just overlooked my opponent's idea here, which was to play f4. And when he played this one, I was just like, oh my god, what have I done? Because the knight on d4 is hanging, and white wants to take on e5 and open up the f file against the f7 pawn. And already I just felt like, oh my god, this position might be lost for black, or at least very, very difficult. It turns out I did have a good idea here, because if not knight d4, I mean, I didn't know what else to do, right? White is looking to take on e6. But the way black should have played this one, which of course Stockfish finds immediately, is to trade on d1 and then play knight d4 here, which is kind of a thematic pawn sacrifice. Here f4 is not as strong without white's rook on the f file. Black can go like rook d8 and okay, it's very complicated still. I might have to sack like the f7 pawn, but it is quite playable. But if white takes on d4 twice, which I think is why I would just discard this normally, I do have some compensation with the dark square bishop, and in fact after a5, black is actually totally fine here. So the key line would be after queen b3 to take, rook a1 check, intending queen e5 check if the king moves. But if rook to d1, I can take on e4, and black is basically equalizing. So it's a bit of a concrete line, but I think it's actually would not have been that difficult to calculate, especially if I realized that knight d4 f4, I'm running into issues. So maybe I would have found that one, but yeah, once we got here, unfortunately now I'm just in deep, deep trouble. So I went into the tank. I ended up finding the best chance, which is just go back knight e6. And now if white takes on e5, I was going to take on d1. And after rook takes d1, I think knight d7 here, maybe knight h5. I feel like this position is actually not that simple for white, because I do want to take back on e5. And then I have a nice structure, and I have this grip on the dark square. So this I think actually would be kind of unclear. Instead, my opponent takes on d8 first, rook takes d8, and takes on e5, keeping the rook on the f file. Probably f5 was actually stronger. We were discussing this after the game. But takes, rook takes, knight d4. maybe it's not that simple. And here black has like some b5 ideas, and at least we got the knight to d4, so we have that going for us. Fe5 though was very logical, knight to d7. And now if white doesn't play their next move, I mean, I am taking on e5 here, and actually the structure looks very, very nice for black. But he has this nice idea with knight d5, where he sacrifices a piece, but he gets these massive pawns in the center. And if knight g5, for example, then e6 comes, takes, d6. This just looks incredibly, incredibly scary for black. h4 also in the air. But I actually have a way out, which I think my opponent, he admitted after the game, he like just kind of overlooked this one. I can take on e5. And the point is, after d takes e6, I do give the piece back, but I'm able to kind of almost equalize the position. So knight takes c4. And now if e takes f7 check, king moves, and I'm winning the piece because bishop on e3 is hanging with a check. So of course white can't take on f7, he has to play queen takes c4. But now queen takes e6, takes, fe6, and all of a sudden we end up in this endgame. And originally I thought, I should have, I definitely felt, much, or at least slightly worse, maybe much worse. I wasn't sure exactly how much, but I felt like maybe there's some holding chances here because, okay, it's equal material, reduced material. Some rook endgames might be holding, I wasn't really sure. But yeah, it ends up being actually very difficult. White goes king f2. And now if I go for the rook endgame like bishop d4, I think this is pretty bad, like king e2, let's say take. The problem is white's king is just way stronger. He has this outside passer with rook c1, b5, and c6. But more importantly, his king is just getting in, king e4, king e5. My king is super passive, my pawns are weak. And yeah, we both felt that white is basically just winning this endgame, which I think is correct. The other option I was strongly considering here, but decided against, was rook f8, which actually might have held the game. So black goes for the bishop endgame. But the reason I didn't like this was because I felt like white has, again, the outside passer, and it just looked very, very unpleasant. But it turns out maybe black can actually hold. So a6, let's say white brings the king in. I go h5, so the pawn's not hanging. And some position like this, I was like really not wanting to hold because I just felt like it's really bad. I mean, if we trade bishops, then the king and pawn endgame, I think, is always lost because white has the outside passer. So I have to avoid the bishop trade. But maybe it's like not that easy for white to actually convert. I mean, the engine, it gives it like plus 0.4, 0.5, which indicates that it's probably a draw with best play. But we talked about it a bit, and we both felt like it's just really, really difficult because I have to avoid the bishop trade. White is more active. White still has a4, b5. But yeah, it might not be that easy, like bishop h6. And the point is king e5 is always met with bishop g7 check. If white moves off of this diagonal, then I'll play bishop g7 to stop the king from getting in. And otherwise, I want to just kind of shuffle bishop f8, bishop h6. I still think it's unpleasant. I'm not sure if I would have actually held something like this in the game because I feel like there's a ton of ways for black to go wrong. But I do think this was basically the only chance to survive. Instead, I went rook to d3, trying to play actively, but this ends up just kind of losing very, very quickly. King e2, I take, rook to d1. And the point is that white's rook is now getting in to d7, and he's able to hold his b pawn with bishop d2. And so he's going to take my b pawn and then have just a very, very strong pass c pawn that eventually is going to cost me the piece. And actually, I think it's just already lost at this point. I don't think there's a defense. I don't think engine finds one either. I try check, rook b2, he gives check, and bishop d2. And yeah, like basically white just needs to defend the bishop, and then he'll be able to take the pawn. Here he finds a very nice move, bishop to e1, and it's basically all over here. He's now threatening to take on b7. If I go here, which happens in the game, then just king e2, defending the bishop, check, king d3. If I hit the bishop again, there's bishop to d2, and b7 is falling. So here, okay, I already understood that it's just completely lost. And yeah, my king is out, my bishop is out, and there's not much to do. I took on g2. Takes rook g1, but yeah, just way too slow here. Takes c6, bishop e5, takes on a7. He could have pushed c7 as well, but yeah, long story short, c7 is next, and then the b pawn, I'll have to give my bishop for the c pawn, and then the b pawn will win the game for white. My pawns are way too slow. And yeah, I decided to resign here because I just felt like there was just absolutely no more chance left in the position. And I didn't want to drag things out. It's just a matter of time. My opponent also felt like, okay, it's just completely over. And so, yeah, good time to call the game. So definitely a tough one here. I mean, I did have some chances to equalize, but of course it's much easier to find these when you have the help of the engine compared to during the game when you have to make these decisions on your own. But definitely a tough game, definitely an instructive one, I think, to learn from, because I'm probably going to keep playing the King's Indian. And yeah, especially this endgame, I thought, maybe is a very interesting one to look at with the bishop endgame, where maybe black could hold after rook f8 and going for this position. So that would end the tournament. Like I said, I would finish with 6 points out of 10, gaining maybe a couple of FIDE points. Overall, I was pretty happy with how I played. I definitely made a lot of mistakes. I had some difficult games, but I won some nice games as well. Of course, I had a fortunate win against Grandmaster Sasikiran, which I'll definitely take. But yeah, overall, I was generally satisfied with my play. Again, a lot of things could be improved. A lot of openings could be studied better, better decisions, better understanding of the middle game, better played end games, and so on. But yeah, the grind continues. Actually, it's December 26th today. I'm headed to Sweden very soon to play in the Rilton Cup, which is another strong open. I've never played in Sweden before, but I'm very, very excited to go there and keep playing 1 round per day, which is very enjoyable. And yeah, I think that's going to do it for this recap. Thanks for watching. Quick plug for the Dojo training program. I should have done this much longer ago, but quick plug. Right now, we're running a special on the Dojo training program until the end of the year, until January 1st. If you sign up and subscribe and become a student, you get a free game review with one of the sensei. So either me, Jesse, or David will take a look at one of your annotated games and give you some feedback, either on stream when we stream game reviews, or perhaps like a written review of your game, and maybe some helpful suggestions as well. So take advantage. If you sign up before January 1st, you get a free game review. But yeah, that's going to do it for this vid. Once again, I very much enjoyed the tournament. I would 100% recommend anyone that has a chance to play Sunway Chess to come visit and play the event. Really strong, great conditions, great organization, great food, really good food. But yeah, definitely a tournament that you absolutely have to try at least once. That's going to do it. Thanks for watching, folks, and hopefully I will see you next time. Take care.